Well, we are lighting the candle, a world that works. And I'm Bill Carell. I'm here with three of highly paid personalities on the internet. We've got Ken Caputo, we've got Lisa Sheehan, and also Jan Jeremias. Actually, we just do this for the love of man. This is all, to kind of share thoughts with each other. And if anybody's listening out there, this is to share thoughts with you as well. We've had some pretty interesting conversations lately, and one of the things that I'm most interested in taking a look at right now is how about the weather? This last week or so has been an extraordinary amount of rain. Last Wednesday, we actually got 5 inches of rain in an hour. And what that did was that absolutely devastated Main Street. It was flood conditions on Main Street with about 2.5 feet of water all the way down the street, and all of that rushed down the hill to go to the river. But what was worse than that was North Street, which is about a quarter of a mile from where I'm sitting on the opposite side of the high school property. All that water went down and flooded out about 5 homes. Their basements completely filled with water, flooded cars, and picked up a whole lot of silt from where they're doing work, over here to some of the soccer fields and stuff. Just was dirt and sand and that sort of thing. And so the weather just came out of nowhere. No one was really expecting this. And it was evidently 2 or 3 days ahead of the hurricane front. I'm not quite sure where it all came from, but that was the first storm. We got two inches of rain later on in the day. So when Mother Nature decides it's time to do some things, sometimes there's a little bit of cleanup afterwards. And it's a good metaphor for our lives as well. When stuff comes through that you're not anticipating out of the blue, and then suddenly there's some work to be done. And I know that I've been watching some very interesting programs. First of all, anybody have anything to say about the weather or what you experienced this past week?
Just the fluctuations in temperature too.
Yes. I think it was 45 degrees out this morning.
It was a week ago. It was, hazy, hot, and humid. So.
Yep. In the 90s. So I think the interesting part of what goes on, and I always liked, it was either Will Rogers or Watt Rogers or Mark Twain that said it. Everybody complains about the weather, but nobody ever does anything. And it's a truism, but at the same point, we more or less can only tell stories afterwards, right? Going through hurricanes, Gloria back in 1985. It was the first hurricane that we had in Connecticut after we bought our home over here. And we had just had our kitchen renovated, and we had this beautiful 5-foot wide set of Anderson windows that crank out. So it was like watching big screen TV on the side of the wall with trees falling down and all sorts of stuff blowing by. So when something like that happens and there's a state of emergency, what do you think the priorities need to be? How do you think it needs to be handled?
But from what standpoint are you?
Well, this
I
is
need more context for that.
What we had on Facebook were updates by our fire chief, Mark Scribner. Basically, every once in a while, saying that the water level on Main Street is rising. Here's how many inches of rain we got. That's where I got the 5-inch number posted on Facebook. And then along the same lines, welcome back, Jan. Keith Rice took some pictures of Rec Park, and it had about 10 acres flooded. Yeah, if you've ever been down here and gone skating in the wintertime, it kind of looked like 5 times as big as the old pond that they used to flood, freeze, and then they'd play hockey on it and kids could come over and skate. But when you're in the beginning of these kinds of things, Um, the folks on North Street got all of their water was accumulations of runoff from the high school property. And it actually created these like 2 foot ruts where the water eroded the ground away and made this beeline down the hill, into people's backyards. But the pictures looked like something out of Hurricane Sandy or something like that, with sand, on top of an engine of a car. That's how deep the water got. It's unbelievable.
It's for
I'm still not. I'm not quite following like what what you mean by priorities. Like,
Well, so the metaphor here is if the weather like this, devastating, unanticipated weather, is a metaphor for life, which I think I mentioned and may not have spent enough time talking about. Um, there are some things that you can do in preparation for events that you've never had it happen before. And this particular event, I don't recall. I've been living here since 1974 in Willimantic. I don't remember Main Street ever getting flooded like that in that entire period of time. Same thing for North Street. This was just a ridiculous amount of rain, and there just was no place for it to go. And so now, in an afternoon, it comes in, it recedes, it goes away, it leaves a mess. And it looked to me like from one of the pictures, there was a house that actually got knocked off its foundation. So this was a serious event. It was life changing for people. They may not even have had a cat to help get him through it. So what's a storm that hits our life that after it's come, it changes things forever? We will not have the same situation in our town after this. And here's the cool part. The homeowners insurance for all of these homes don't cover flood. They don't cover flood. And at our elevation in Willimantic, it's not a floodplain. It just happened to be the recipient of more water than the ground could adequately handle. So from a planning standpoint, I don't know. What's next?
Everybody buys flood insurance.
Yeah, that can be pretty spendy.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also this is an interesting thing. I had to have flood insurance for one of my homes down in Florida. It was in a 500-year floodplain. And if you know anything about the geography of Florida, Florida has a ridge that runs north to south from up in the Ocala area, pretty much all the way down to Sebring, and then it starts to flatten out, towards the swamp, O'Keefe and O'Keefe swamp and that sort of thing. So they had we didn't have to have flood insurance when we bought the place, but they had paid out an incredible amount of money with hurricanes and whatnot, and they decided they were going to charge and have a requirement that everyone have flood insurance. And in my case, it cost $2,000 a year, and we'd never had a flood. So an analogy for this is when the world changed and derivatives failed when we took Wall Street bonds that were backed by mortgages, which were not supposed to be after the 1930s, but they rescinded the law that made it unlawful, to have mortgage-backed securities, and it put us into a recession for 10 years.
All that comes to mind is learn by your mistakes or from your mistakes.
well, and I guess the other thing that's just kind of I guess there's always that weighing of potential risk. So, so if you look at Katrina, there were things that if they had been willing to invest more resources in a city that's below sea level, that the damage that was done could have been mitigated because the risk of that happening was pretty high. The risk of flooding in Willimantic was a lot lower, even though, everybody's coming to terms with the fact that, weather is trending towards more extreme, overall. So, and then what just happened in Libya, they came out, they couldn't have protected the property, but if they had had better ways to communicate with people, they could have mitigated the human element of it, the loss of life. So they might not have been able to do anything about property loss like they probably could have, in New Orleans, but and I don't know, I'm not informed enough on what the level of risk of that flood occurrence was, you know, there as well. But even that, there's a significant distrust, higher in some countries than other, that the people who are telling you there is risk, that you're going to believe them. So if you're not going to believe what they say, then things are going to happen, because the weather is going to be what it is, disease or, an asteroid, whatever it is, you know, so, so, so I guess that's part of it. And then, the other thing, just from a life metaphor, it's just how do you, as best you can, make investments in advance of the potential weather systems that will come and go in your life. So if you put time and energy into your health, then when you get hurt or sick, you're going to be more resilient to it. If you ignore it until afterwards, that's a different thing. I remember someone telling me that Florida always survives hurricanes better when there's been more hurricanes, because they said it's a hardening, because stuff gets knocked down and they build it back and it's stronger. But they don't build it in advance. They wait till stuff gets knocked down, probably partially because you don't know. I guess it's hard to know what the weak links in the chain are until things start falling. But over time, if they've had a lot of weather systems, the whole environment becomes more resilient because you've had to allocate resources towards strengthening it. So we're always playing this dance. It's like, do you do things that are good for your heart, never knowing you could smoke cigarettes your whole life and never have a heart attack? You could be one of those. How do you want to weigh those risks? It's hard.
Good
But I
point.
But
Go
I
ahead.
think also, even with everything you do, if you happen to be a proactive person, let's say, and you take care, there are still things that might happen that you could never plan for. And you have
Yeah.
to know how to navigate when those things happen. So it's not like, yeah, I can I can speak from my own experience with things like that. Had something happen, was I prepared? Absolutely not. I wasn't. I mean, doctor was shocked, I was shocked, but it happened. And then I had to decide how I was going to move forward from that. And you just, hopefully you're resilient enough and you're kind of cultivated those resilience kind of skills to be able to, get stronger from that, whatever that experience was or whatever that circumstance was.
I guess, where's your center of gravity too? So like,
Right, exactly.
from a fitness perspective, I've had people say, why exercise that much and try to be that healthy? You could drop dead of a heart attack anyway, or get hit by a bus.
I have people
And
who
I'm
say,
thinking, yeah, I'm thinking like Hans, live well, die quick. It's like, if I'm able to run a half marathon and I drop dead doing that, I'm more interested in the quality than the quantity anyway. So,
mhm,
but that's me. For other people, they're
mhm,
not thinking that way, or they're not, that's not how they contextualize their experience of their life. So I think that, going back to the situation you're talking about, Bill, you have that too. Like, how many people during Hurricane Katrina would rather, the context of their life was, I'd rather use those resources for that potential risk for something else. So, and in their world, it was worth it. So, and maybe that worked out for them. Maybe they didn't even live there. So when the floods hit, it didn't hurt them at all. And they're like, hey, I won that lottery, you know? So yeah, so it's kind of complex.
It's a good way to look at it, and to kind of go back and just review what happened. And you guys can correct me on this because I heard the story secondhand from my wife. She said there were two dams that burst in Libya that wound up taking out two cities with a total of 40,000 people lost. And that's the sort of thing that, having some property damage seems like a small paper cut. And the other part of it is too, which I like what you said, if there were a way to analyze what the cost for prevention might be in advance. And in Florida, basically, a lot of those homes just had to be torn down and built up because they didn't have good hurricane strapping. They didn't have, the level of engineering that goes into building something that can withstand 120 to 150 miles an hour wind. But the other part of it is, getting back to the life metaphor, I love what you said, Jan. I mean, a lot of the decision that you make is that if I'm going to get knocked down, it's going to be a priority for me, to stay, as grounded as I can and be in the gobsmacked, state as little as possible, and back into good shape and working again. And it's kind of funny. Sometimes that seems like, in retrospect, just looking over the last year, and I would say that one of the weather patterns that's come through my life, like a tornado, has been the number of close relatives and family members that are now gone. And that just got to the point where, despite my best effort, I want you to know, I couldn't even sit down and write sympathy letters or cards in many of the situations because I just felt, just completely lost, is the best way to say it. And that's where I think I lost the bubble in terms of getting out of the gobsmacked state more quickly. And I think that's an important thing because it definitely is. So you think you want to be a millionaire, you really do have to have a phone a friend. You have to have somebody out there in the world that can help get the grounding going again, and not allow to be in the position of completely being ineffectual or actually not participating in life. And I think anyone who's lost something, anything, like there are many people that I know that have lost everything, gone into bankruptcy, gone through that whole traumatic experience. Immediately after that was over, wound up getting divorced, and on and on and on it goes. And some of those people I've had high admiration for, just the ability to get out of bed every single day and not the covers pulled over your head. Tonka agrees. So what is the first aid kit for completely being knocked off the rails?
First thing that came to my mind was just learning and educating yourself about going through situations, like even something as simple as not simple as inevitable as death. People just don't want to accept it. But like over the years, if you learn like what death doulas do and things like that, and how it's just a natural process instead of something to fear. Because I know my life has changed a lot just regarding that alone, and not that the shock of losing someone isn't going to still present itself, because it will, but you can't prepare yourself for the actual event. And I won't even let myself think of certain people leaving this world, until it happens. I'll deal with it then. But I am learning and studying about how to deal with death and for yourself and for others. And I think that goes with a lot of different things, life experiences too. You can just learn more about what others have done through it. how to store up your shores or whatever whatever that statement is. Be as most prepared as you can.
Well,
I'm
not
reading in. Oh, go ahead, Bill. Sorry.
I was just going to say not as a prescription, but I think in a large part, um, getting through tough times in the past, I could give the credit 100% to my friends and
Mhm.
relatives, the people that were there, to encourage, getting back in the game more quickly. And now the field is getting kind of sparse in terms of where the encouragement can come from. And part of that's because I don't think that I've spent the same amount of time in the last 5 or 6 years building really deep friendships as I did probably the 5 or 6 year period before that. So there's a little bit of advice for me right there. Ken?
Oh, so I'm reading a interesting book right now called No Self, No Problem,
Mm.
which is looking at the neuroscience behind a lot of Eastern philosophies like Buddhism, Taoism, that kind of thing. And it talks about how the left side of the brain is the pattern seeking side and the side of self, the storytelling side. Like the right side of the brain really doesn't even have language to frame that. So it makes it very hard to have right brain conversations or understanding because you can't frame it with language. And I remember with my mentor, he would do spiritual counseling with people, and you knew when he would connect into the right side of their brain because all of a sudden they literally had no words because they were thinking with a part of themselves that couldn't have words. And he'd always get excited. He's like, that's good. That means you're in the right place. So, so if the stories you tell yourself around self um, give context to those events, there's like a high level of attachment to them. It's going to be a lot harder to navigate them. So, so if material things and money are woven into yourself, bankruptcy is going to be a very, very difficult thing for you to weather because of how you framed it. The story you're telling yourself about what that means, whether it's ego or whatever, if you have a different framing with that, you're not impacted by that. If like you have very little, I'm working with a guy right now who lives in the Australian outback in a tent. He's been there for 2 years. He's from New York City originally. He's just been moving slowly west, and he's like a really cool guy. Actually, Jan, you know him. This is Gary.
Yeah, I figured it was
Yeah.
Gary.
I just had an amazing conversation with him, and so his context is very different from someone who's owns a home and a car and all those kind of things. So so I think that's how do you have right brain conversations with yourself in a way that gives you a perspective that allows you to as best you can navigate difficult situations. People lose the use of their legs and they're incredibly inspirational. Other people lose their legs and they take their life. It's too much. That's the story that they've learned to associate with the use of their legs less than the actual situation itself.
I think it's far deeper than the story. It's how much of their identity is actually wrapped up into that.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, if if your total persona is dependent on a spouse and that's your entire identity, if that relationship ends, you're devastated because basically you're gone because there was no identity outside of that. So I think that, so that's when you say story, I think it's almost, to me, it's not even sufficient because I think it's so much of it, it's how you identify yourself. Like if you identify yourself or your value, let's say, only by something like money, then yes, if you're bankrupt, then you've now lost who you are.
Yeah,
Yeah, the author goes, he goes much deeper. I was just sticking with the
Yeah,
surface.
okay, because I was
But
gonna
he
say,
talks
a lot of
about that. Yeah. Yeah, no, he goes way into the self and the fact that the self in the end is an illusory construct that's a pattern full of data points that we see as factual that we've put into something that makes sense to us. But it's rarely actual reality. It's the way we framed it based on language and experiences, but then he takes it down through all those levels, and he's doing it not philosophically, he's doing it through neuroscience, which is really kind of cool.
well, those are the patterns, the synaptic patterns that are created, which,
Mhm.
the more you basically, the more that pattern is visited, the more established it gets.
Yeah. Yep.
And then it's almost like, a reflex that happens, and you don't even, it's like not even like you feel like you have a choice. It's just so automatic.
Yeah.
Is that like attachment theories?
Yeah, I think it kind of stems into a lot of that. And and the interesting thing, what he's advocating for is it's very often, and I was thinking about this a lot because right now I'm focused on what are the strengths and weaknesses of our ability to actually utilize consciousness so that you can better recognize when you're wrong and when you're right, and how much that even matters at the time, so so he's looking at the fact that generally speaking the left brain that's framing things, looking for patterns, even if they aren't there, just that need to do that and find some concrete sense of self that doesn't exist. It's overactive. And the right brain, which is much harder to actually strengthen that, like to bring it into balance. So what ends up happening is, like right now, you hear, things like critical thinking skills. That's valuable, but it's actually only half the equation because you're developing your ability to seek patterns, but you're not developing the right side's capacity to frame that in a nonverbal context. So it's just really interesting. So all of those things, like anything that has to do with identity and self, is kind of hanging out in the left side of the brain. And a lot of the research was from people with epilepsy where they had to separate their brains partitioned so that the two sides don't talk to each other. And it was crazy the stuff that happens, like the experiment, not really experiments, but the way that they would interact with the world because of that. So they learned a lot about how they work together and how they can kind of create imbalances that lead to a lot of the difficulties we face in life. So, so bringing it all the way back around, Bill, it was just what struck me about it was part of this conversation is if you have I think I actually have my right brain because of all the practice through years is a little too active relative to my left brain. I need a little bit more organization and patterning to come into balance. So, but I'm a little rare in that because most people, especially in Western cultures, are going to be a little bit more developed or active in their left brain, and they need to breathe or meditate or paint or something that cultivates and wakes up the right brain a little bit until they kind of find some semblance of balance with each other.
Yeah, it also sounds like it's pointing towards an unhealthy relationship with that. One that's causing you pain in your life or one that's upsetting or something of that nature. But there are people who basically believe that they know nothing about life, and that's a Stoic, probably from Marcus Aurelius or somebody like that. Is that you know I'm better off than most people because I know nothing. And the other part of that is that being imperfect in our ability to perceive things and actually record what's actually happening, we're really only left with a story about what happened as opposed to the objective facts of this happened, it was this temperature, anything that's specific and measurable. More often than not, it's getting a coding. And if you're saying that the emotional reaction to the story is on the right side, then that might be So I'm still playing with
Yeah,
what you're talking about because I haven't heard it expressed this way before.
yeah, yeah,
I won't go there, but my point is that there are some people that believe your memory is nothing but a story about what happened because you're an imperfect vessel for carrying the actual what happened.
yeah. And this isn't don't it's not so much about emotion. Like that's its own separate thing. That's kind of responses to, you can have emotions in a right brain dominant, kind of mindset, just like you can in a left brain. So it was more like to me, with this, having studied the Stoics, and and really I enjoy the Stoic teachings, especially Marcus Aurelius and Seneca too. Actually there's a lot of good ones, but really a lot of the things that they were saying were about the relinquishing of self. Even the way they would live, the way they were so willing to even give up their life, was this very similar to a Buddhist relinquishing of attachment. They just had a different language that they were framing it around, you know? So, and that was kind of his point, is, a lot of times the language that we use, even the sequence of the words, the way we form sentences, which is different depending, like some languages like ours have a lot more future tense. Other languages don't even have that. Not really. It's all present moment in the way that they speak. So those were the things he was talking about as far as the left brain. And then the right brain is less about thinking in terms of patterns and more about the fact that your memories and your future have no reference base to your ability in this very, very moment, which is already gone, to feel the chair beneath you, to feel the breath come and go, to be in conversation with people. All of that context, it framed the experience that you're having, but it's irrelevant because you're here, you're present and aware in this moment, and it's the only moment you truly have. So, and I'm like totally like cliff noting this. He says it in a much smarter way than I am. I'm just trying to, it just seemed like an interesting thing from the perspective, and my personal experience with grief and loss
Yep.
has always been, you know this process of the left and right brain, this understanding of what that meant, that gives you the feeling of loss, but then decoupling that from who you are. Like, you can experience sadness, but the sadness doesn't necessarily have to be you, you know so
Well, I've been around a bunch of people who've had some pretty severe loss in the last few years. And when I hear, most of them getting to a point in their life where they just start burst into tears and they don't know why, it sounds like it's also, related to what you're talking about, where there's no language for how what they're dealing with. They don't have, you know,
yeah.
they don't have words that would allow the situation to do. So it's like a very young response. Like when you used to just laugh or cry before you had any
Mhm.
language at all. And we still do that from time to time when things are that bad or that good.
when I was taught when I was coached through grief like that, one of the things that was shared with me is, that what you're saying, that just nonverbal emoting, um, it's crucial, especially in the first 6 months, or it ends up getting kind of entangled and gets seeded as trauma that later you're going to have to unpack, or there's going to be some unintended consequences to it. So it's like experiencing the grief without having to make sense of it. And you wonder how often people are trying to make sense of something that can't, rather than just rest in it because it's uncomfortable. We have this need to contextualize it somehow.
Yeah.
But now we're applying self to something that may not necessarily require that. I don't know.
I think that a lot of times emotions are very challenging to put into words. And when I talk to people about emotions like that, it's almost identifying where it lives in the body. So embodying it much more somatically than
Mhm.
it is, actually describing it. Because sometimes it cannot be described. and you can't articulate it at all, but you can identify where it is in your body, like where it's located, where you feel it, whether you feel it in your stomach, your throat, your heart, your chest, and just trying to be with that as just the raw kind of energy versus trying to label it, because I think we do. I think we get stuck on the labeling of like what it is exactly and why
Yeah.
we're having
Yeah.
it and what does it mean. And sometimes we can't, and let alone explain it to somebody else, like we don't quite understand it ourselves.
Right.
And some, and I'm not saying we never will. I've had experiences like that where, and I just had to sit with whatever it was, that emotion or whatever, and then just or talk people through it. Like I talked a client through it this morning, and it's just, and then if you breathe space around it and give it a little bit of just, I want to say space or breath around it, a lot of times it will reveal itself to you. Like you will end up understanding.
Yeah, that's what comes with experience. And when you're truly experiencing it, it will disappear. And if you're fighting it or in denial, it's going to keep coming back up at the wrong time.
And that's more like what I was saying about learning different things. I mean, like talking with a Jan or talking with a Can and talking with a Bill. I mean,
Yeah.
you can learn all sorts of things. I mean, whether it's mindfulness or meditation or yoga or exercise or anything, there's stuff out there, especially these days. You could, type in grief in YouTube and you'll find a whole bunch of things that are, ways to deal that are different than you ever thought, kind of thing, instead of, like you all said, brushing it under the rug, which was the old way of dealing with things, and trauma just doesn't get stuck in your cells, it gets passed on. So you don't want to do that anymore.
The
And
gift that
it,
keeps on giving, right?
right.
Yes.
And
Well, and actually, that's a really interesting thing, Lisa, because that's something else I've been really paying attention to. So you go on YouTube and you're looking for, you know, for for understanding that
Mhm.
you currently lack, which means that you don't really know how to stand guard way to the doorway of your mind. So so I'm like playing with this idea of how do you recognize the patterns in what they're saying that help you make a connection to how truthful they're being, and not even from a manipulative standpoint. So they may have found something, this works for me for grief and I'm so much of an advocate, and I found these things, these patterns that confirm that what I'm doing works, right? So so now that doesn't mean that's anecdotal. It doesn't make it true, it makes it true for them.
Mhm.
So and then someone else might have an experience where it's actually hurtful, it's harmful to them, you know. So with all of this information, how do we sort it and and figure out, like, so, and that's where it's this kind of metacognitive approach to, all right, i'm 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 experiencing a pattern of confirmation right now in the knowledge that's being shared with me, from the source, from what they're saying, from how they're putting it together. How do I safely test that and also make sure that if I'm going to then pass that on, I'm that's a wise decision for me to make. And on the flip side of it, not getting completely paralyzed by indecision or becoming so untrusting that you don't believe anything you hear or see anymore. And some people are there now. So that's what I'm kind of dancing with. I don't have any answers, but it's certainly interesting.
I think that's where like discernment comes into, like, and
discernment.
I consider myself pretty good at that. And then to Jan's point, I can almost feel when something is right for me,
Mhm.
or true for me. And if I do pass it on and it doesn't work for somebody else, then I hope they have the discernment to do it too. But I was able to
Yeah.
I was able to, have a really bad teacher in college. And a person said, I don't know how you guys are going to make it in the real world with what you're learning from her, but somehow I managed to take the gems that she was putting out there and utilize it in a modern way. So
Yes. So many college professors should go to jail for malpractice, no doubt about it. They're practicing medicine or law without a degree and other things. But I think the neat part of it is that when people can get to a point of self-trust, I think it errs to the side of thinking they know, the opposite direction from thinking they know everything to being inquisitive about what they don't know. You know, it's
Mhm.
like a different way of engaging the world. And I kind of like what you're saying, Ken. And there's an interesting thing you know, is it even possible to be that self-aware to be able to stand on the sideline and you know, hear what you're hearing and then hear that you heard it wrong? You know,
Well,
that's
yeah,
a super superhuman
yes, that,
ability.
yeah. And I guess that's because, I think we have to recognize that we can't truly trust ourself, because self is a lie. It's an illusion. So it's a construct. So, so that's what's so interesting to me is, so there's that part of, like, where do you find the balance place where, you know the 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 nonverbal side is, it feels right, and then on the pattern recognition side it seems true. And then, I think the most important skill, just as we're talking about it, is the ability to let your mind be changed, to recognize I was wrong. New information came in, and now this doesn't feel so good anymore.
Mhm.
Knowing this, so I'm not going to force the pattern to continue to work, or I'm not going to protect that self that maybe isn't serving me. I'm going to allow it to die and something new to be born. That's terrifying, especially if you don't know what's happening. It's like, so it's just such an interesting thing. This like, and a lot of, when you look at like Zen practice, a lot of it's resolving paradox. It's two things being equally true that don't necessarily confirm each other, you know, and that's a sign of our own ignorance. We just don't know enough to confirm it because we don't know everything. So it's like, so then now you've got an element of faith, which also can be, so they're all like these tools that, sorry, I've been really excited about this lately, if you can't tell. It's just this kind of playing with it. But it's, so you have all these tools, and they're like the swords that can cut both ways, and you never know which side the edge is facing. So you're like in this dance with yourself, and then when you get cut, you got to have forgiveness and compassion for yourself and say, yep, I was wrong. I probably should have turned the sword around this time. I don't know. I just threw a bunch of word salad out there. I don't know what I just said.
I'll just a
No
conundrum.
worse than anyone else, especially not me. That's for sure. I think it's a remarkable thing, you know, to bring up a new concept in a conversation and then elucidate it by demonstrating exactly how it works. And the whole uh, struggling with giving the language that explains a concept that you're learning yourself is exactly, you know, demonstrating the point. And it's, I think it's perfect. I think people self-trusting enough to know they're going to live after they try to do something and it doesn't work out, you know. And it's kind of fun. But while you were saying that whole dialogue thing about, you know, I'm this isn't working, I was wrong, and all the rest of that, I can't imagine any 10 people that I know that would have that going on in their head. They would just have like a 4-letter word, an expletive, you know, in place of all of
Sure.
that breakdown, right? But
Well,
I
and
think
that's like, and Jan, a lot of what Jan does when you're doing yoga, what you're doing is you're calming that sympathetic nervous system that wants to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. One of those things is going to happen, and instead you're soothing that, so that instead of the 4-letter word, you can start to have actual free flowing conversation, with yourself.
Well, in the yoga word is lila, which means play,
mhm.
Ah, oh, I
right?
like that.
Which is sort of like that play all the time. Like, how far can I go? How far, is that, could I push myself more, or will I get hurt? Or do I need to step back and kind of honor where I am, and that line and that balance between the two at all times, and no matter what you're doing or no matter what pose you're doing, and then sitting there and making mistakes and saying, okay, I was wrong in that case, like, and whether you can learn from that. Like, if you get injured doing something like more than twice or three times, finally you have to ask yourself, like, Why am I doing this? Like, what is the purpose of that? Like, do I identify with it? Am I hooked on like everybody thinking I'm really cool? Like all those different
Yeah, yeah.
group setting. And it's always this Leela, this play between, you know, and that balance between listening and observing. And, it's all of this, whole dialogue that goes on in your, hopefully in your head or in your heart or wherever it is.
I'll give you some confirmation for that. In our teacher training model, we've got like 8 different kind of skill pathways that you follow, and one of them was implementation, and we changed that to practice and play, because implementation, it puts so much pressure on, like, you had to get it right instead of it being an experiment that informed you, so you could engage in a process of skill development over time. But we literally had to shift the language for exactly that reason. We should have called it Leela instead. I like that better.
Well, I remember my teacher training, sitting there with my friend Penny, who was training next to me. And my teacher Cheryl used to say, "Well, go to your edge." And we used to turn to each other and say, "What's that? Like, what's your edge?" Like, kind of thing. And then we learned that we weren't the type of people that we're not going to go to the edge. Like, we were going to go to the edge, or we were probably going to go
Right, right.
far. And that's learning that about yourself, that's the type of person you are. And knowing that, okay, well, if that's my tendency, then I actually need to step back, but it's in the beginning, those questions of like, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah.
Go to your edge, kind of turning to each other, looking for an answer, saying, "Do you know what that means? I have no idea what that means." Like in the whole thing, you know.
Well, and with every instructor manual, there comes all the bullshit terms at the back that basically says this will make them go wow. You know, you're going to use terms like that to kind of get people coming back, and it's really we're talking about play, and that implies that there's a work. And the biggest difference between the two of them, the definition that I have, is work is totally intentional activity that's desiring an outcome, a specific result or an outcome. And play is to give and take without intent. It's just you're doing what you're doing and you're having a ball doing it, and there's no keeping score. Now,
Can
most
there be
people,
intentional play?
Yeah, like
well, yeah,
because
it's
that's I
being
think that's what it is, intentional play. When you actually place yourself in postures or poses or whatever, it's with intention, and it's intentional play. Like you're purposefully putting yourself in situations like that over and over and over and over again.
well, it's like a front of the hand, back of the hand. There can't be play without work on the other side. So the work is to intentionally put yourself into the position. The play is like the seeking mastery in terms of I'm only doing this to see what it's like, as opposed to getting a result. And I think that's kind of a working reference to it. And the word play is something that most people don't have much facility with. They think of it as frivolous. They think of it as wasting time. They don't see the point.
I
I
think
mean,
it's
when you,
become more popular now too, though.
yeah,
Sounds like a left brain pattern to me.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, for example, if somebody, we've had this conversation before, but when you see somebody and they look a little bit out of gas, you go, like, so like, what's up with you? I've been working way too hard. Okay. Have you? Okay. Well, can you imagine if people just showed up and they were spent and out of gas and they said, "Man, I've been playing my butt off." And it's working. So the tools to get from the work side, which is to try to understand, and the frustrating part about understanding is not everything can be understood. And the play part of it is to get back to where it doesn't matter anymore. It didn't matter to you before it happened. There was nothing to do, nothing to figure out. But we always do think that an event has to be explained away. We are just little answer machines. We got to keep,
Hmm.
no, that's not it. No, that's not it either. Maybe she just doesn't love me anymore. I don't know. You know,
And
it's
it's interesting, like, just from a survival perspective, that we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for this highly evolved ability to recognize patterns.
yeah,
So it's like someone in my tribe ate that and died. Okay. You have to understand the pattern, to do that. Actually, he did a really interesting one. He said, when you look at a book and you think you're seeing words, but all you're seeing are patterns that mark the page in a certain way.
Yeah.
And if you were to see the same book in a language you don't understand, you would just see marks on the page. You wouldn't have the pattern recognition to see it as language and to be able to read it. So it was such an interesting thing how, when you think through that perspective, it's something that it can lead you down, like paths that aren't necessarily to your benefit, but it's something that loves you. It's how we survived. We're constantly trying to correlate things, but the problem is the same person ate the plant and died, but the plant didn't kill him. They had a heart attack. And now for decades, no one eats the plant, and they all take that as truth when the
Yes.
plant is perfectly safe, you know? So, so there's like these flaws built in to the survival process that are just fascinating to me thinking of it that way.
All the truisms on YouTube.
Well,
Either
I was
buy
I was just thinking of a funny story that reminded me of a funny story um, when I lived in Manhattan. I at points went to a synagogue that was in Washington Heights, and on Friday night services, they would go around the room. They would kind of dance around the room, and there was a point where they would all duck, and it was like kind of like they'd all drop down, kind of like in a rhythm. And I was talking to somebody, and she told me that's because in the original synagogue there was a beam there.
Ah,
And and as through time it just got to be this pattern which got passed down, because
yeah.
that beam hadn't been there for like 60 years, but it was just like they would all duck at that point in the song. It was actually, that's what that reminded me of. It's like that, those things
I
that get
love stories
there,
like that. Yeah.
it's just like, okay.
It's like cutting ends off the roast, and
The
someone's like,
roast,
why
yeah.
do we cut the ends off the
Yeah,
roast? And they
yeah.
trace it back, and it's because the oven was too small.
Right,
But you kept doing it because that's what you do. And you
that's what
build all
I would
these
do.
stories around why it cooks better and all of this, and none of it is true.
Right, it's
But it
just like,
feels true to us,
right.
well, I think it's interesting, and I love the bringing up the printed word. This just reminds me so much of when I was growing up and reading things for the first time. The characters in To Kill a Mockingbird looked really different to me than Gregory Peck and the other folks that were in the movie. When I read the book before I
Hmm.
saw the movie, and the same thing with Gone with the Wind and some others. Uh, all of the Hardy Boys series, Tom Swift. I must have read 30 or 40 of the Tom Swift adventures, and it just really was interesting to discuss what I thought with some of these characters. And in some cases, my mom had only read the Reader's Digest book form of some of these books. I read the whole book, and she came away with completely different memories than I did about what we read. And other people, if you remember having a book study and going chapter by chapter, with a whole class, it's remarkable the things that some people remember that other people don't. So it's all part of that. Like, how are you receiving the moment, and what color hair do you think that Rhett Butler had? You know, so
Yeah.
it's interesting. And then our idioms such as the frankly scarlet. I don't give a damn. That's because it was an easy way for people who were imitating Clark Gable's voice to conjure up that role. And the other one was, play it again, Sam, which never got said in the movie. Play it. You played it for her, now play it for me. But that's what gets passed along. Is where did you hear? Somebody else heard it first, and it becomes a truism. In the culture.
Well, I'm a big poetry reader. I think I've shared, and it's always interesting to me when you read a poem and then you hear the author of the poem talk about that poem and what they meant by the poem.
Right.
It's like not anything from what you took, from that poem. And years ago I went to hear David White, the poet in Manhattan, and I remember meeting him, and he was so not like I had envisioned him in my head, like on stage. I mean, afterwards, but I mean, I think I've read enough poetry and gone online to listen to a number of poets talk about their work. It's always really interesting. I love when I read the poem first, because then I have how I feel about the poem and what I thought it meant, and then I hear theirs, so it's not coloring my perception. I like create my own idea of what it meant for me, and it seems to have more meaning. But it's always really interesting to me to actually get what they were thinking or going through when they wrote that poem.
Yeah, Bob Dylan and John Lennon were really masters at just throwing words together and let people sort it out in their own hearing. It's like so important, and he says no matter what I write, they're going to interpret it as something different anyway. So let's let them have a ball with it.
I like that.
Yeah. Well, we're getting close. Anyone have any kind of wrap-up thoughts that you'd like to put out there?
Another thing that came to my mind was I've been actually I just ordered Michael Singer's follow-up to The Other Untethered Soul. So I was listening to him, and Jan, he likes to use yoga as like a way of getting to the self, like to get to that point where you've never been physically before, and relaxing into it, and to do that with your ego to get to that point. So that's the self, and the things that Ken was talking about too, get to that who you be.
Who you be.
Yeah.
Who are you really?
Right.
That
That's
Living
fun.
Untethered, is that his new one?
Yes.
Yeah, I have that on my list. I haven't listened to it yet though.
Audio, you do audiobooks for that?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
I do. There's no way I'd be able to keep up with a book a week,
Yeah.
like minimum. I try to do 50 books a year minimum. So I have to listen. I do it while I'm running and walking and
No, that's good.
wandering.
Yeah, a lot of these books are like 17, 18 hours, of audio. And that to me is, I do a lot of skipping around, and I also wonder sometimes if I couldn't read it faster than listening to it, I don't read a lot of printed stuff anymore unless it's technological, or, history or something of that nature. But it sounds like a good place to kind of hang out. Jan, any final thoughts?
No, I'm good. I'm good. I'm just thinking I could wish everybody a happy new year. If you're Jewish, since that's, I'm coming off of Rosh Hashanah.
Well, there's an argument for we pretty much all are if we're not in China, So I think that's a really neat thing. Happy New Year right back at you.
Yeah.
What's the year? 5,000 what?
Oh my gosh, I actually never know what the Hebrew 5,784, I think.
Well, I'll tell you what, you lie and I'll swear to it, okay?
Okay, yeah.
Well, with that said, I want to wish everybody a marvelous week, and leave you with the thought that I pretty much always do, and that is to reach out to somebody in your sphere, let them know that they matter to you and that your world works because they're there. And we're lighting the candle, a world that works, and it works because we say it does. So let's get busy. Bye-bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, a world that works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch us each week, as well as the rest of the network, at exvadio.com/podcasts, as well as the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.